Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Emory Climate Talks. My name is Eri Saikawa, and I'm an Associate Professor of Environmental Sciences at Emory University. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar in these very difficult times. I was thinking when I started this webinar series, and it was actually on March 31st. So it's been more than 2 months now. I cannot thank you enough for sharing the space together, coming to learn when there is so much going on. So this webinar series is made possible by our anonymous donor that supports our trip to the UN climate change negotiations. And this is in partnership with the Department of Environmental Sciences and the Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory at Emory University. As you have heard, we are recording this talk, and I have turned off your microphone. If you have any questions during the talk, feel free to use the chat function to type up the questions so that we can raise them during the Q&A session. And I would like to encourage you all to sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. I have put that information on the chat as well. So today we have Dr. Debjani Sihi as our speaker. She is a Post-Doctoral Research Associate at the Environmental Sciences Division at the Yunque National Laboratory, which is one of the Department of Energy labs in Tennessee. She does really important work looking at the dynamics of soil organic matter decomposition and greenhouse gas emissions in various parts of the world. She is a modeler, but today she's going to tell us about soil climate health policy nexus through a sustainability lens, which is, I think, perfect for what we are going through right now. So with that, Debjani, thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eri. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It looks like more than 30 participants, so that's exciting. So Eri went through my intro quite well, so I'm not going to do a lot of background here, but what I would like to emphasize that this webinar is going to be an exploration of soil climate health policy nexus through a sustainability lens. So I'm having trouble in slide advance. Let me stop share and do it again. Can you confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see it. And if necessary, I can also share your slides too if it doesn't work for you.
It should work.
Yeah, now it's moving.
Yeah, but it's not in the flow. Okay, I can use my mouse.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Yep.
So here's the outline for you for today's webinar. And what you will see that I will give you a bit introduction of what this nexus is for. And then there are the 4 pillars of the talk today is the connection of soils with climate, food production, policy, and human health. And then I will end up with a brief take-home message. But what I want to highlight here is that this talk is going to be revolving around all these different 4 pillars, because these 4 pillars are actually interconnected. And this is done under a framework of sustainability. So before I move forward, I want a favor from you all. So if you can see my screen, I have a poll here just to get a familiarity of how much you are familiar with the topic that I will going to discuss. So if you can use or answer to this poll by text, you can text my full name, Debjani Sihi, followed by 558-237-607. And then you will get a link, and then you can answer your message in A, B, C, or D. It's just multiple choice. Or you can use this webinar, this link directly, and you can choose those from your browser. So I will give you a minute or so, if you don't mind, to just respond to this poll. And also let me know if there is any problem. Awesome. We get only 1 response so far. I see there are 35 of you. So if you don't mind to go to either to the text box or your browser and just select how much you're familiar with the topic that I'm going to tell today. Great. Okay. Anyone very familiar so far? I'll give you a few more seconds to respond, and then I will lock the poll. All right, looks like, okay, we still have answers. Come on, we need at least one person who is very familiar. Okay, I think I got most of you answered, and I'm gonna log this poll now. So it looks like at least 70% of you are familiar or somewhat familiar with what I'm going to talk. And for those who are not familiar, I hope you will be familiar after this webinar. And of course, I can be reached after this webinar anytime if you need. So let's jump into the introduction. I'd start with this famous quote once said by the former US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. So one of the things that you might not know when you come to this webinar is that I'm going to talk a lot about climate change and how soil is connected with climate change. So climate change is happening because of the emissions that we are doing through either fossil fuel or any other land-based management practices. And we are increasing greenhouse gas emission in our atmosphere. But I'm assuming you may not heard or you may not be so familiar that soil is one of the really most efficient natural solution to this climate change. Soil is also where we grow our food. This is the place where we start growing our food, and we also depend a lot for our health issues. So a healthy soil is responsible for sustaining our society through healthy food, as well as through health of our plant, animal, and the planet. But on the flip side, we have been treating soil as dirt for a long time. And if we want to keep soil continue to sustain our life and our society, we must stop to do that. And there are also certain policy measures that are in place by different national and international stakeholders that are exactly to meet this goal of sustainability through a soil lens. So let's keep unlocking the secret in soil in the next few minutes. So as I said, I will first start with the connection of soils and climate. So here are the few facts of climate. Anthropogenic emissions are releasing approximately 9.4 billion metric ton of carbon to the atmosphere through various activities like fossil fuel emission, intensive agriculture, and the other way we use land like deforestation. But you might be surprised to know that all of these emissions are not actually staying in the atmosphere. Only half of the emissions that we are doing are actually staying in the atmosphere, and the rest are actually sequestered, both in land and also in ocean. So land and ocean and these natural ecosystems are actually uptaking almost 50% of our carbon emission. But now think about how much land area we have on this planet. Only 25% of the planet area is land, and the rest is actually water. And out of those 75% water, more than 97% is actually ocean. So you can imagine how much important this land area is for reducing our emissions that we have been doing. And another surprising fact here is that scientists have been ignoring this capacity of carbon sequestration. That is the method through which natural ecosystems sequester or uptake carbon. For a long time, scientists have ignored the role of land in the sequestration of carbon. Why? Because you can see it's a negligible portion if you think from an aerial perspective. And this is where soil comes into play. Soil is one of the most important land-based natural resources that we have, but at the same time, it is one of the least understood systems. So here are some facts about how much carbon is stored in soil. Soil contains approximately 315 times more carbon than we released into atmosphere currently. And soil contains approximately twice as much carbon as we have staying in the atmosphere as well as plant combined. So if you can think about that for a moment, think for all the lush tropical vegetation, think about the giant sequoias, all the cultivated land, all deserts and all grasslands. And then the carbon that stays in the atmosphere globally. And then we combine those and multiply by 2. And that is the size of this reservoir. That is the size of this soil carbon storehouse. So how soil carbon is formed? Soil carbon is actually photosynthesis actually source of soil carbon. So green plant capture carbon dioxide from atmosphere through a process called photosynthesis that happen in presence of sunlight and rainfall, such as water. And then these bodies of these green plants died, and then they become part of the soil. But also there are teeny tiny microbes in soil that can chew on those dead bodies, and it can release carbon as well as other greenhouse gases like methane and N2O to atmosphere, and the process is known as decomposition. But the important point here is that soil is actually a long-term carbon storage for this climate change compound. And why this is a long-term carbon storage? Because the way carbon is stored in soil. So here you can see that the soil carbon is stored in various chemically and physically bound forms. So there is plant root. We have this green hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi, which actually form network around plant roots. And then those networks fungal network also emit a gluey substances that can actually hold or bind the soil carbon to the mineral compounds. And here are some examples of very complicated chemical and physical bonds that organic carbon can form with the minerals. And there are our vulnerable carbon pool, which are actually decomposed through microbes and released as carbon dioxide into atmosphere. But we should not get too comfortable because worldwide, almost half of the lands are degraded now. And when land degradation happens, a lot of those long-term stored carbon are actually released into atmosphere as compared to this pristine non-degraded land. So we release this carbon, but in the process, we also release a lot of nutrients that we rely on for our food production and our human. And when the soil are degraded, it also reduces or diminish its capacity to act as a plant or to act as a sustainable media for plant growth. So there are multiple problems associated with degradation. And here are some examples that human society have been doing soil degradation since last few years. So deforestation is one example, clearing forest for agriculture, intensive agricultural practices, as well as overgrazing. These are one of the main examples by which we cause land degradation. And here is another even more bad story. So this is a story of soil carbon loss at high latitude. So at high latitude, if you think about traveling to Arctic tundra, these soils are actually frozen. And these soils are actually these soils contain a 1/3 of the total carbon in the global soil. And if you think about the climate change, the rate of climate change happening in this Arctic tundra are almost twice than the rate of climate change in terms of global warming we are facing at the rest of the world. So these systems are actually facing a lot of warming, and as a consequence, this frozen carbon, which is stored in the system for a long time, they are actually thawing. And when this frozen carbon are thawing, the microbes can actually release this carbon into atmosphere. And in the process, it can actually have a subsidence as well. So what I mean by subsidence here. So subsidence is the sudden sink of soil elevation through the process that I just described here. So when subsidence happen, it just not release carbon or carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It can also cause a lot of damage to construction. So it can actually have a serious issues for the sustainability of Arctic community. And think about that, when this CO2 are released from the subsident system, it can actually, the thawed front are actually grown faster. And then it can actually make all the carbon available from ancient pool for another type of microbes, which are methanogenic microbes, and that can cause emission of methane. So methane is more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And when this kind of things are happening, then this permafrost thaw, if we continue to thaw in the future, what you will see that it can cause a serious impact on our global warming. So that can even do a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop that can cause even more subsidence, even more CO2 and methane release. And in a sense, not just this Arctic tundra, but also another high latitude ecosystem like boreal forest, they can get a lot of this thawing of their vegetation, thawing of their soil. And when the thawing of the vegetation happen, especially in the growing season, you can have a lot of fire as well. And fire in Arctic tundra and boreal forest are also real problem, because it is actually causing the loss of this legacy carbon, the legacy that it has for last few years, probably 100 or 1,000 or even millennia. And it can cause loss of those really stored carbon. So you can see the consequences that we might face. So now think about the food production system, which are actually happening at the same time that we are facing this soil degradation and climate change issues. So here is an example of Florida Everglades. So Florida Everglades has a long-standing history of land use change for agriculture. So here you can see the pristine, the pre-drainage condition of Florida Everglades, which are actually pre-drained wetlands. In early 90s or late 90s, there are a lot of attention of the growing food production in this agricultural area. So they drained the wetland and they made this Everglades agricultural area. And here in your right, what you can see is subsidence post that was actually put forward by some of the alumni of University of Florida. So here you can see when this Florida Everglades are drained, they are actually losing a lot of the carbon. So this is the subsidence post, which was actually installed there in 1927. And when it was installed, the soil was actually here. So you can see over 90 years, it almost lost approximately 6 feet of soil through subsidence to oxidation of this organic rich soil. And that subsidence caused a lot of carbon emission. But intensive agriculture has another consequences too, like environmental pollution. Let's take an example of application of nitrogen fertilizer in intensive agricultural area in terms of urea. So when we add this nitrogenous fertilizer, this fertilizer can get converted into nitrate through microbial activity in the soil. And that nitrate can be transported to either surface water or it can be leached to groundwater. So when nitrate concentration or any nutrient concentration increases in surface water, it causes harmful algal bloom formation through eutrophication. And that is actually causing loss of oxygen for this aquatic life and this death, causing a mass death of this aquatic organism. At the same time, the nitrate groundwater pollution can also have health consequences. So here is an example. We often rely on drinking water. We often rely on aquifer for drinking water. And when a baby is exposed to nitrate-rich drinking water, it suffers from a syndrome called blue baby syndrome. So what happened there is the nitrate in their body actually can convert it to another nitrogen form that can actually bind hemoglobin. And then the baby are actually suffering from oxygen and their skin turns into blue. So these are water-related issues and health issues. But there are other issues as well. So the nitrogen we add in the soil, that can also get converted to either other nitrogen oxides. So nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, these are termed often as NOx, which you may already know these are really harmful air pollutants. As well as agricultural soil is the biggest contributor of another potent greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide, which has almost 300 times warming potential than carbon dioxide. So you can think of a subsequent cascading effect of intensive agriculture. So before we continue to degrade our precious soil, just keep in mind how long it takes to build soil. It can take around 1,000 years to produce just 2 to 3 centimeters of soil. But we have to continue to grow our food because soil is the only source, other if you ignore the hydroponics for the moment, that's where we have to build our food. At the same time, we have another issue of increasing food demand. So it is assumed that by 2050, we would have an increasing food demand by 70%. At the same time, the ongoing climate change are posing risk on this crop yield. And by 2015, it is assumed that there will be a decrease in 25% of crop. So there are many different problems that are in operation at the same time. But I would say there are ways that we can actually handle these problems. As we created these problems, we also know the solutions. And the solutions are to actually make use of climate smart land management practices. So what do I mean here? You can manage the land in a way that is smart to capture carbon in the system, as well as to capture nutrient. And then when it captures carbon and nutrient, it can also be more healthy. So what are the ways that we can do that? It has to be smart through the ongoing climate change. And one of the first point that might come into your mind is like, how about we put back the forest in place? And maybe we can add more plantation, or we can add forest with agriculture. We can do things like less disturbance to the soil. We have to grow our food, but we can adopt technology like conservation tillage, which are less disturbing to the soil that we are using. We can plant deep-rooted plants, because deep-rooted plants has the ability to help the soil not get degraded or eroded. Or we can actually add organic carbon to the system by various ways, like adding compost or manure. You can leave the plant residues on top, or you can actually cover the soil so that it does not get degraded. So these are one of few many ways by which we can actually conserve soil. We can actually let the soil not degrade. At the same time, we can face this climate smart strategies. So there are actually policy intervention that are actually could be done to help us attain all these different goals. And one such policy initiative was actually launched in the Paris climate meeting in COP21 in 2015. So this is known as 4 per mil. So what is 4 per mil concept? So 4 per mil sets off a very aspirational goal that the goal or the objective is to increase 0.4% of carbon in soil annually through the different land management practices. Example, the climate smart land management practices that I just mentioned you earlier. So this way, the soil can capture carbon for food security and climate change mitigation. And at the same time, farmers can also use those carbon as a tradable community in the carbon market. So there are a few programs happening across USA and across the globe where farmers are actually using this carbon incentives, this offsets that they are gaining carbon from this different land management, climate smart land management practices, and selling those credits to people or companies which cannot meet their carbon emission goal. So it seems like a win-win solution, right? But there are many other benefits of actually storing carbon in soil. When soil carbon is stored, it can actually favor many other beneficial microbes and other life forms like this happy little worm. So it can actually make the life full of life. It can increase the biodiversity of soil. And the biodiversity rich soil is a healthy soil. So healthy soil can actually address all these different issues that I mentioned related to carbon storage, the benefit of water and the environment, attaining food production, food security, as well as this biological diversity. So now I can shift the gear a little to more focus on human health aspects and how the soil health and human health are actually connected under the ongoing umbrella of climate change. I'm assuming a lot of you are already familiar with this very famous depiction of how climate change is actually impacting human health. But maybe you may not realize there are actually direct connections when soil health is actually interacting or interfacing with this climate change and human health aspects. For example, air pollution through NOx emission from aerosols, or through dust, through soil erosion, wind erosion, and as well as soil degradation. It can cause diseases like asthma, cardiac diseases, or other respiratory illness because dust is also an allergen. The chemical that we add to our agricultural system can also lead to water bodies, and it can cause this harmful algal blooms and other associated problems. We are also suffering from malnutrition based on the soil nutrient storage, as well as there are also concept of this migration of like climate change migration, which people often call as soil migrants as well, from degraded system. Like I gave you example of Arctic community. So there are actually 5 ways or 5 modes by which soil health influence human health. Human nutrition, food safety, microbiome, freight and transport, and community health. So I'll go one by one. First, start with human nutrition. You can see here, the soil is rich with many nutrients, not just macronutrient, but also micronutrient. And we human and all other living organisms on this planet actually rely on nutrient from soil through the food chain. Either this nutrient can be transported to plant and then we get those nutrition from our vegetarian diet, or if you are non-vegetarian, those nutrients can get transported to animal and then we ingest the animal. So we are actually dependent on soil nutrition. We are dependent on soil for our nutritional demand. And those nutrients, as you might guessed already, are needed for many different functions in your body. But guess what? Globally, 2 billion people actually suffer from malnutrient deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, especially iron and zinc. And this micronutrient deficiencies happen when we actually degrade these soils. And as I say, when we soil degrade, we just not lose carbon, we also lose this many precious nutrient from the soil. So now food safety. As I mentioned, one of the climate smart strategy is to add carbon to the system. And the way you add carbon to the system is through manures from either from plant source, or you can add manures from these different livestock. Or there are other inputs like water. When you add this input, you add carbon, you add nutrients as well. But there are also situations when you add this microbiome. So what is microbiome? Microbiome is the consortium of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and many other microbial life forms, which are actually present in these waste products that are coming off these livestock. And there are chances that this microbiome can contain some pathogenic bacteria, fungi, or viruses. And when we actually get exposed to these different pathogenic viruses, bacteria, or fungi, there are situations when we are causing foodborne diseases. And this is especially true for green leafy vegetables, because when you process the food, there are chances that all these pathogens can be sterilized. But when you are not handling this food safely, then there are chances that you can get exposed to pathogen and you can contract foodborne diseases. Following the same theme for microbiome, there are chances that you can actually transfer the microbiomes that are originally present in these livestock, and that microbiome get transferred to soil, soil through food, and food through us. So one example for microbiome transfer is antibiotic resistant bacteria or gene. So these livestock are often the time grown with a heavy dose of antibiotic in their meal. Why? Because oftentimes livestock production system want to grow their meat faster or with less food. So they add antibiotic in their feed. So when they are exposed to a lot of antibiotics, they can get actually antibiotic resistance bacteria or gene in their microbiome system, in the microbes that they have in their gut. And a lot of the time, those gut microbiomes can be transported to the waste product. And if we do not process this waste product, which is sometimes tempting for microbes because these raw materials are actually very nutrient rich. And these are actually also less expensive to apply, because when you go for composting in a larger scale, it is also a cost associated parameter. So if you add this raw material, there are chances that you can add this antibiotic resistant bacteria to the soil. And there are possibility that you can give those antibiotic resistant bacteria to your gut microbiome through the food that you eat on those contaminated soil. And now I'm talking about the food and transport. So one example that I gave you for the side effect of intensive agriculture, the freight and transport of nitrogen that we add in the system. Here is another example, which I'm afraid is even more problematic. So there are growing consensus of urban farming and gardening in the urban areas. And if these urban farms and gardens are contaminated with heavy metals like lead and arsenic, because lead are often used in different lead-based paints or pipes, arsenic have been used in history for different processing of wood and other materials like pesticides and chemicals in urban farms or orchards. So let's say if farmers are, or the urban farmers are getting exposed to this lead contaminated soils or arsenic contaminated soils, then they can actually get those leads and arsenic heavy metals in their food. So often the time, children actually working or playing on those contaminated soil can also contract, even they are more efficient in contracting those lead and arsenic contamination in their system. But the fate of those transport also depend on how much bioavailable those heavy metals and metalloids are. If the heavy metals and metalloids are bioavailable, then the food we eat absorbed in our body very quickly, and then it become part of our body and our system, for example, as well as in blood. But if these lead and metalloids are non-bioavailable, then it can actually leave our human body to the digestive tract. So the fate and transport of these chemicals a lot of the time also depends on the bioavailability. And finally, for the health aspect is the community health. So community health is a concept that if the community get exposed to a contaminated soil, then as a whole, they can become sick. So this is an example of a study found in CDC website. So here are stories for a few US volunteers who actually went for a house building service to Mexico, but they got sick from a soil fungus, which were actually present in the soil that they worked on. And they actually contracted yellow valley fever. Here is another example of community exposure and community health from World Health Organization. So when, especially in the developing world, when people are living in low sanitation area, there are a lot of consequences of the soil transmitted helminth infection. So helminth is the parasitic worms like roundworm. And you'd be surprised approximately 1.5 billion people are actually infected by the soil transmitted parasitic worm diseases. And here is also another thing is like how the socioeconomic aspects are actually important player in the soil transmitted health issues. So there must be ways that we actually handle these issues, and there are policies in place for health related issues. So 3 different policies related to human health, soil health, and environmental health interactively working together, and there are parallel enforcements as well. For human health, the regulatory agency is FDA, Food and Drug Administration. For soil health, the regulatory agency is USDA NRCS. And for environmental health, the regulatory agency is EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So these are the few acts that I have listed here, but there are many other acts that I did not list. I'm not going to read all these different acts, but you can see that when we have acts like clean air, clean water imposed by EPA, it is actually related to this human health that can also get related to the nutrition that we get into the system and the nutrition that leaked from soil to water. And then that also get related to this food security issue and this watershed protection issue, because that is exactly where if the nutrient we are adding to the soil is lost, then we are actually not getting the food security benefit. So in a sense, all these policies are also interacted. And we are living in this pandemic, so I had to throw this out. So soil is connected with pandemic through history. So this is an example. Soil can serve and has been seen to be served as a breeding ground for bacterium that causes plague. So I know many of you have been looking at news during this pandemic. So what is the survival time of this novel coronavirus on our surface? So now then, putting that in perspective, think about it. The bacterium that causes plague can survive in soil 24 days. So 24 days, almost a month, it can survive in soil, and they can be a breeding player. But there are also good stories with soil. So here is a good story of soil and pandemic connection. Tuberculosis, which is another pandemic that still developing countries are facing. And the vaccine that are derived for the cure of this tuberculosis are originated from soil microbes. And this gentleman here actually won Nobel Prize for studying the soil microbes that led to the discovery of streptomycin. And as many other part of the society, the soil science community are also thinking about how we practice our science beyond this COVID-19 pandemic. So you can you have seen that there are EPA enforcement of Clean Air or Air Quality, Clean Water, or Clean Water Quality Act. But there is really not a Soil Quality Act or Clean Soil Act. So this is high time that we should think about it, given soil is connected with so many different things in our society. But more so to a broader perspective, what we have to think from an One Health perspective. So it is not just soil, it is not just human. It's also connected with our environment and the animals. And what we have to do is work in an interdisciplinary team and working or giving our insights to solve this problem in an interdisciplinary manner, starting from the soil scientists, which are actually overlapping with this biology, ecology, earth sciences community, to the engineers, to the social scientists, humanities, as well as in the medical fields and veterinary fields for sure. So you can see now, if you have a knowledge on soil, then actually you can serve in many different sectors, starting from academia to the government sector or the policymakers, environmental stewards, the consultation firms, maybe NGOs, even industry, chemical industry, food industry. Of course, gardening and farming is related. And the most pressing sector under this pandemic, you can think about the medical profession and healthcare professional. So this is where I think a person like me, who is an interdisciplinary scientist and also passionate about all these environmental issues, can really play a role. And I have been working at this interface of soil, climate, food, health, and policy. And the idea is to achieve the sustainable development goals. So I have been traveled to different parts of this world, which actually have a spectrum of both climate as well as a spectrum of the socioeconomic conditions. And if we all put this together, you can think about the sustainable development goals and how a person with an interdisciplinary focus and a knowledge in soil can help to meet these goals. So I'm happy to say that soil has direct connections with at least 6 of these goals: zero hunger, good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, climate action, life below water, and of course, life on land. But as you might know that all these 17 sustainable development goals are also interconnected. So in a sense, you can actually connect soil with many other sustainable development goals. So let's example, we increase soil quality and functionality through increasing its productivity, adding soil carbon, higher yield. Then you can address issues with no poverty. That can go to zero hunger, good human well-being, gender equality. If you have address issues with clean and water sanitation that I mentioned earlier, then you can add or work on other sustainable development goals related to affordable energy, decent work and economic growth, as well as inequality reduction. And then last but not least, we also, soil scientists and in addition to other earth and environmental scientists, work in this climate action. And when we work on this climate action, we can actually work more on the sustainable cities and life on land, which ultimately can cause peace and justice in a strong institutional commitment. So what are my take-home messages? We have been using land, we have been misusing land for several years, and the soil degradation through land mismanagement can cause elemental imbalance, it can decouple the cycles, and it can actually cause reduction of per capita useful land. When you have elemental imbalance, that means there would be imbalance of the carbon and nutrient that is in the soil. It can also impact climate change through emission of greenhouse gases that I mentioned earlier. That can actually cause a lot of reduction of this organic matter. And when reduction of organic matter happen, you can also have poor plant growth. And when we have poor plant growth under this climate change situation, we can actually have poor nutrition and nutrition both for human as well as for livestock. And then that can cause low productivity. But this nutrition issue is also related to further soil degradation. So when we lose this soil, we further degrade organic matter, we further lose the biodiversity, and we actually cause more decline in this quality of the soil. And then in a sense, this nutrition and other soil degradation related issues are actually causing many human health problems like malnutrition and the elemental toxicity that I just mentioned, as well as obesity. And then these different overlapping circles can also cause hydrological disruption, the disruption of the water cycle, disruption of the elements in the water like nitrate pollution in water that cause imbalance in nutrient in the water. And then when all these different vicious cycles are actually acting in place, it can even cause pandemic. And there are connections that I showed you that cause histories. So if you have to break this overlapping vicious cycles, we really need to stop soil treating like a dirt and give the respect that it deserves to shape the destiny of our society and our planet. And with that, I'm done for this presentation, but before we move for the Q&A, I would like to know, what did you like or learn most from this webinar? So the same way you can go to use your browser or use the text box and then give me answer in a single word. Let's say you like most about the climate change connection. So because this poll will pop up with a word cloud, so it will not, you are not allowed to add two different words. So let's say you have climate change, you have to add climate_change. Human health, human_health. So with that, I believe we have time for at least a minute or so to jump on this poll. And I really would love to get the feedback here. So let's do it. You can use the browser as well as the text the same way that you used earlier. And let me know if you have problem.
Debjani, should we wait until we get the questions answers for this? Yes?
We can do that too. Yeah. So I can put it.
Or we can start the Q&A as there are some coming in while others are putting in the answers. Is that okay?
That is okay. Then I can stop the screenshot and I'll share it again later.
Okay, sounds good. Well, first of all, a round of applause. That was great. Thank you so much. And we already have 2 questions in the chat, so I wanted to go with that. But please keep them coming after you type one word that you in the poll. Okay, so the first one is coming from Kina. She asks, a March 2020 story in Food and Environment Reporting Network says, new studies reveal some long accepted climate smart agricultural practices may not yield hoped for carbon reduction benefits. Can you please share your thoughts about if you think there is a lack of scientific consensus and how it impacts legitimacy of carbon credits for carbon smart agriculture?
That's an excellent question. Actually, I have read that story. So of course there are certain limitation. So I can give you a personal story. So when I was working in India, I worked in a corporate sector / public sector connection to promote this climate smart agriculture. So the idea there was to get organic farming in place that are certified, and that way you can track the carbon benefit. So we have to wait until 15 years or so to actually get the carbon benefit that we are expecting from this climate smart strategy. So yes, it depends on where you are working. It depends on how degraded the system that you have started with. If the system is really degraded, like the system I worked on, which have been exposed to intensive agriculture for like almost 4 to 5 decades, then it may take time. It will be slow. But if we continue to do that, we will go to the stage that we are aspiring to go. But let's say even you are not able to fulfill all the goals, but still you are on the right track, that you get the benefit of carbon. You can also get the benefit of getting more beneficial microbes, get the soil more healthy, and that can actually promote food production in the long term. So yeah, legitimacy of carbon credit are important. There are also some political intervention here. There are issues that we know sometimes we cannot handle at our own perspectives because of carbon market strategy, especially for soil carbon, are actually growing. But there are few companies or few agencies like Nature Conservancy, the American Carbon Market, they are actually working on those directions. So yeah, there are challenges for sure, but we can hope to go toward meeting this goal, at least in a slow pace, if not in a very rapid space.
Okay, great. Next question from David Lin. Could you comment on the role of soil bacteriophages? I think that's how you read it. I'm sorry if I didn't read it right. And other viruses on soil health through the sustainability lens.
That is a great question, David. So as you can imagine, bacteriophages are the viruses which can kill bacteria. So in a sense, it can kill a lot of beneficial bacteria, which are actually act in play for this different nutrient cycling. So virus can have negative impact for nutritional aspects in this sustainability lens. So it can cause death of beneficial bacteria. It can cause a destruction of the soil biodiversity, which can actually reduce the productivity and the carbon storage. And on the other hand, there are certain bacteriophages and viruses, they are also pathogenic per se. So when they are pathogenic, they can also cause several health-related issues. And there are plenty of examples that I can send you after we finish here, that they are actually, there are evidence that either in the USA or throughout the world, there are bacteriophages related health issues. So yeah, it can cause a disruption in all those different sustainability sustainable development goals, starting from food, no hunger or something related to food security, as well as the carbon related aspects and the life on the land and all those things.
The next question comes from Yanyu Wang. Thank you for the visual attractive presentation. I am curious, when you mention various climate smart agricultural practices based on the high temporal and spatial heterogeneity and lack of field empirical data, how can we better give the recommendation which areas should adopt which practice?
That's very timely question, and that is exactly what my answer to the first question is also related. So there are strategies that you also think, and that is why the data from this long-term practices can help us. So there are organizations called Long-Term Agricultural Research Organization, which are actually international community who actually, from where you can get data from many different worlds, from long-term this land management practices, either reduced tillage, conservation tillage, organic farming, other land-based management practices like adding cover crop, adding other cash crops, adding manure, fertilizers, or organic fertilizers. So what we need to do is like, there is not like a one answer to every questions. You also have to optimize it. So for example, I'm working in a system where the soils are really organic rich. And then we may have to think about the strategy which are working in organic rich soil. Like I gave example of Everglades. In that case, the drainage of organic soil is the most important problem. So at that point, you have to think about maybe we can balance the water table. We can produce crops which are, there are practices of rice cultivation instead of sugarcane that have been done in Everglades, because in rice, you can have some standing water. And that way you can actually can limit the carbon loss from those systems. So that is an example of very organic carbon rich. In that case, you should not apply or should not go for conservation tillage, because what you need is ponding, make anaerobic. So definitely you have to look for long-term history, and you also need to look for long-term practices from the world, because all these things are also, so there are concepts like you have to act local, you have to think global, you have to get the data from global, but you need to act local, which is actually specific for your system. And that also depends on the type of soil that I mentioned. It depends on what are the staple food for that area, what are the crop that it can grow. So there are areas that you can, in the corn belt, you cannot think about, oh, we should grow soybean instead of corn, because that's not sustainable. So things like that actually also depend on local practices. And for that, the ideal thing is to reach out to the local experts in this area. And I'm happy to talk more about how we can reach out to these different local experts in this system.
Okay, the next question comes from Brian Thorne. He says, you mentioned that humans are dependent on good quality soil to meet our nutritional demands. With that in mind, do you think there needs to be greater governance on how soil is managed and or exploited in urban agriculture?
Definitely. Yeah, so in urban agriculture in general, I see more problem is from those pollution from heavy metals. That is the biggest challenge. But as you see, we have to depend on the nutrition. And again, this is where the geography and the locality is an important issue. So it depends on how much, what is the type of soil in the area that you're living with. Is it a lot of sandy soil that you're living with close to the coast? Or is it like you're living in the Midwest? It's a lot of organic rich soil. So if you're in the organic rich soil, the benefit that you can get, the nutritional benefit that you can get are a lot more than if you're living in a city which is close to the coast, which is a sandy soil that do not have a lot of organic matter and the nutrient that we need. So definitely there are like regulations, as well as there are local extension agents, agricultural practitioners, the professional that work in this area, that can guide you more on the nutritional demand direction. But yeah, there are some things that you need to keep in mind, like how much benefit that you can get from the area that you are working with.
Okay, I will ask first Tracy's question and then get to David's again, because I think it's more related. So Tracy says, thank you for the presentation. What are 3 implementable policy recommendations you would make for addressing soil degradation issues in the US?
So first and foremost, one recommendation is keep following the policy already in place to not degrade soil, to not, if you keep following policy for water quality, air quality, then in a sense, you also have to get your soil health related policies in place. The second policy recommendation I would say is think more of the conservation side. So there are policies of watershed protection, there are policies of soil food security protection, a food security act from USDA and NRCS. These are the agencies which are actually working on those policies on food security, watershed protection, that are very tightly linked with the soil conservation. And if you think about the third recommendation, I would definitely say, think big, where you can get win-win solution from all different aspects. you have to gain a lot of carbon, but carbon is not the only solution. You have to think about adding nutrients, but having those safe policies related to adding nutrients in a safe manner. In that way, you have to think about the policies related to safe handling and policies related to those less contraction of the contamination is something very important. So if I have to give one big answer, I would say policy on soil health, or more on one health related policy that you should keep in mind. We actually keep all those different sectors together in one big picture, which is more sustainable for our future community.
Great. I think that links very well to David's second question, which is, how do you determine the health of soils?
Soil health started with actually really very abstract idea. So in a sense, you have to keep the soil healthy. That means you have to keep all different aspects of soil characteristics, I would say. So you have to keep the physical, chemical, and biological characters in an optimum balance. There are many different measures of soil health, and I think one good source is to go for the Soil Health Institute in North Carolina. They put together many different metrics for soil health policies, and soil health measurements and the matrices can be done either thinking from what are the beneficial microbiome. Are we actually gaining the beneficial microbiome that we need for our food production, that we need for the nutrient availability in the soil? What are the aspects of soil physical health? That means, are we getting loss of soil structure? Are we getting, like, if you think or picture about a degraded soil, a deserted soil, that is not healthy in terms of its physics, because soil structure is broken. In terms of the chemical aspect of soil health, you have to think about what is the chemical makeup of the soil. Are we adding a lot of the toxic chemicals into the system? Are we having proper balance of this chemistry? So there are definitely different matrices that can go more and more, like CO2 emission, decomposition, metabolism of soil. These are also different matrices that can actually capture the healthy system or the healthy biological health of the soil. So yeah, I can add the list a lot. There are in fact more fancy soil health matrices based on next generation sequencing techniques that can give you even more idea of what are the microbiome in the soil. So there are many different aspects, and this area is actually evolving quite a bit in the recent decades. So.
Great. It does not seem like there are any more questions. So Debjani, did you want to share what everybody was saying while we wait, if there is any more last questions that you forgot to add to the chat box?
Yeah, it seems like the responses are not recorded. I'm assuming why.
Maybe everybody was very shy. I mean, I actually tried the first poll and it did not work for me.
I think
some people might be.
One problem for the first poll was I had to limit it because it's a free account. So I had limited response that I can record. But for the second poll, it is activated, but we'll need to see why it is not working.
Sometimes the technology doesn't work as we would like. Yeah. But I think that's okay because we already got a lot of great questions. And there is one more. So Carrie asks, thanks for the great talk. Sorry for the late question. No, it's okay, Carrie. Perfect timing. Does CO2 fertilization, in parentheses, increase atmospheric CO2 availability to plants, close parentheses, interact with changes in soil organic matter to accelerate or slow soil carbon capture or to change micronutrient content of plants?
That's a really intelligent question. So CO2 fertilization can actually impair nutrient availability in plants, especially nitrogen. So there are concept of progressive nitrogen limitation. So plants nutrient nitrogen for their tissue building. And if there are a lot of CO2 fertilization or a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, then plant can take a lot of carbon. They get the carbon, that's carbohydrate need, but then they are losing their nitrogen need. So when those plant bodies are actually entering the soil, then you are also dealing with that nitrogen limitation. So that is one side of how the soil carbon changes are interacting with the CO2 fertilization. So CO2 fertilization per se do not change a lot on the decomposing microbes, because the microbes that are releasing soil CO2 are relying on the dead carbon. That's why they are also known as detritivores. They are relying on the dead carbon. But it actually impact those microbes as well, because the health of those microbes, the growth of those microbes are dependent on the dead carbon, which are coming from plant. So even if there is no direct linkage, there are also indirect linkage. And if you think about carbon loss, as I say, there are also nutrient loss. And most of the studies so far have looked at nitrogen limitation, because nitrogen is so important for photosynthesis and other processes on our planet. But yes, there could be consequences of this micronutrient content as well, because as you have limitation, as you have dilution of nitrogen, there will be dilution of other micronutrient as well.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any more last minute questions, Dr. Sihi? If not, let's give her a round of applause again. Thank you so much. And before we depart, I just want to invite you to our next webinar. That's going to be next Wednesday at 3 p.m. again. And we are inviting Michael Shannon, who is the CEO of Cherry Street Energy, because as many of you might know, Emory is going to be implementing a lot of solar panels, and that's going to be done by Cherry Street Energy. And actually, one of the Emory alum, Daniel Uribe, who some of you might know, is actually working at the Cherry Street Energy. It's really exciting news for us. So he will tell us what's going on, what's going to happen at Emory, and what does it mean for renewable energy in Georgia. So I hope you can join us. And with that, I hope you all stay healthy and safe. Thank you again for joining, and thank you, Debjani, for your talk.
Thanks.
So we'll see you next time.
Thank you.